Money for housing, not for profit. Money for housing, not for profit. We want to welcome everybody who just came in. I saw two elders back there. Everybody's here today. We have the information and we're going to use it. And we're going to move forward and we're going to make some action, revolutionary action take place. Okay, we're going to now move downtown with our sister Quinn from the Coalition Against Anti-Asian Violence, which is an organization that's been very important and active concerned over the years. And our sister is going to talk about what's happening in the Asian American community, Chinatown community, and all of them.
Hi, I want to thank our Tenants Council and everybody else who organized the conference for inviting me to speak here. It's really great to be here. When I was first starting out organizing tenants in Chinatown, I really didn't know what I was doing. And so I knocked on the doors of a lot of organizations for help, for advice. And a lot of people told me back then, Chinatown, the situation there is just too complicated. You know, can't even think about how to organize people in Chinatown. And it was really discouraging for me to hear. And the first person who actually really took me in and said, it's great what you're doing and let's talk about working together was Ms. Bailey at Harlem Tenants Council. And you know, when I came to visit her organization, it was back then it was on 125th Street. It was a tiny little office. The phone was ringing off the hook. She was there all by herself with no one else. And it was clear that she had her hands full, but she said, you know, let's sit down, let's talk about, let me tell you everything that I know. And so I'm really grateful for all of the support and the solidarity that we received from Harlem over the years. And I'm glad to be here to return the solidarity back to Harlem. I'm going to talk a little bit about gentrification in Chinatown. I'm assuming that everybody here knows or have been to Chinatown and knows what it looks like. Just to give you a sense of who lives in Chinatown, I'll talk a little bit about the demographics. Chinatown is actually the largest concentration of Chinese immigrants in the Western Hemisphere. Not just the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere. It's home to about 70,000 people. And the majority of them work in low-wage restaurants and garment shops. Most people work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They have very minimal worker protections, extremely low wages, and no health insurance. According to the 2000 census, about 22% of the Chinese people in New York City live below the poverty level. And more than 95% are renters. Since the mid to late 1990s, we started to see a lot of the people who live in Soho and Lower East Side and Tribeca who can no longer afford the rents there start to move into Chinatown. And as I'm sure you're very familiar in Harlem, when they start to move into Chinatown, it's not just them who come, but it's everything else that follows with them, right? So a lot of the mom and pop stores, all of a sudden they become these luxury boutique stores, and then they also turn into these bars, very stylish bars and boutiques. And then also a lot of the commercial spaces that used to house garment shops, they turned into high-tech offices or posh lofts. Of course, a lot of the tenement apartments were gutted and they turned into luxury apartments. And central to this change in the makeup or the look of the community is the displacement of tenants and small business owners. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how it happens in Chinatown. And I'm sure the stories will be very familiar to people in Harlem, to Williamsburg, to Washington Heights. The first strategy that the landlords use in Chinatown is first they cut off all of the basic services. So I've seen buildings where tenants have lived for 9 months without gas. Electricity is cut off, no hot water. That's very common. And the problem in Chinatown, as with many immigrant communities, is that they have nowhere to turn. I mean, I've been into buildings where nobody in the building speaks English. So, we would go to the city, we would go to HPD and say, look, the situation is atrocious, what are you going to do about it? And they'll say, well, it's very simple, you just have to pick up the phone and call 311. And then we'll say, well, a lot of people can't speak English, and they can't communicate to your people on 311. And they'll say, well, oh no, but, we have multi-languages, we have translation in all these languages. So one day we actually tested it out. We went to a building where tenants have been living without gas, and we went with a video camera, and we documented exactly what happens when tenants try to call 311. And so somebody who doesn't speak any English will call 311 and start speaking in their language. And then, first of all, the operators would be like, what? What? And then they hang up. So then we are persistent, we keep calling back. Eventually, they'll figure it out and they'll get somebody on the phone to try to test out what language they're speaking. Usually they'll get someone who speaks a Chinese dialect but not the one that they're speaking. It takes a few tries to get the right dialect on the phone, right? And then it also takes a few tries to get their housing specialist and the translator on the phone at the same time. So by this time we're like the 5th or 6th call trying, right? Finally, 45 minutes later, we get the right dialect and the person on the phone all at the same time. And then the translator is somebody who is like sitting in their house in Minnesota or something, and they're patched in, right? They have never been to New York City. They've never seen a tenement house in New York City. They don't know the situation. They don't know the housing laws in New York City. So, and the housing laws are very technical. So even a professional translator doesn't understand how to translate some of these things, right? So eventually everybody is frustrated, and we ended our call that we were videotaping on our video with the translator actually giving the tenant a 10-minute lecture on why they should learn English so that they can communicate with their landlords. So this is the sad story of 311. And this is the reason why so many tenants, even when they're being harassed by their landlords by cutting off all of these basic services, are not able to seek the proper help and try to protect themselves in that situation. The other tactic that landlords use in Chinatown to kick out tenants, of course, is by taking them to housing court. The situation in Chinatown is that so many tenants are actually very vulnerable to legal action in housing court. Number one, even if they are legal in their apartment, a lot of times because they're working such long hours, when they're taken to court for wrongful reasons by their landlord, they often have to choose, do I go to housing court so that I don't lose my house, or do I go to my job so that I don't lose my job, right? And a lot of times when you go to housing court, it's not over in just one time, right? They keep having you coming back and back and back over and over again. And a lot of people who are living in these low-wage jobs in restaurants and garment shops, they don't have job security. They can't ask their boss for a day off over and over and over again. Eventually they're going to be fired from their job. And so that's a very tough situation for immigrant tenants or low-wage workers who are tenants, period. The other reason why people are very vulnerable in Chinatown is that a lot of immigrant families or people of color families don't just live with their nuclear family, like mother, father, daughter, and son, right? A lot of people are used to living with their extended families, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, cousins, right? But in our cultures, that family bond is just as strong as a nuclear family, right? But the housing laws don't recognize that as a so-called immediate family, and you don't have a right to live there. And if the leaseholder is not living in that apartment, you don't have a right to inherit that lease. And that's a huge problem in Chinatown because right now, with the economy being the way it is, with a lot of the garment shops closing down, a lot of the manufacturing going overseas, there's not enough jobs for all of the immigrants who are living in Chinatown. So often what happens is the head of the household usually goes to another state to work. Sometimes people go as far away to Texas, to North Carolina, to Florida to work in restaurants. And they may be there working for 6 months at a time. But, when you work in a restaurant, you don't have job security. So you could be fired, or you have some problem with your boss and you quit your job after 6 months or 9 months. And you always need some place to come back to. These people, when they go to Florida, it's not like there is a Chinatown that is their community there, right? They're living in isolation. They're basically there just to make a living so that they can send money back to their family in New York, send money back to their family in China. As soon as they lose their job, they need to come back to New York, and their home is in New York. But the law says, if you are the person whose name is on the lease, and you're not living in that apartment for 6 months, then you're basically illegal. And everybody who's living in that apartment is illegally subletting, right? And everybody in that apartment may be cousins, uncles, not your immediate family. So that's the situation in Chinatown. So a lot of times the landlords will take the tenants to court for, number one, non-primary residence, number two, illegal subletting. And in that situation, it's very, very hard for us to win that kind of case. So in this way, landlords in Chinatown, or these real estate speculators, are buying up buildings, and then they're clearing out the building, fixing it up, and then raising the rents overnight, $2,000, $3,000. And once the rent goes up, obviously it's never ever coming back down. And that means that low-income tenants can never ever hope to move back into that building. And that's how we are losing low-income housing stock all over Chinatown, as we are all over New York City. So when I was organizing tenants in Chinatown, I used to just really grapple with this question. Sorry, it's the same ringtone as my phone. I thought it was mine. I used to really grapple with this question of why is this happening all over New York City? And I wasn't here last night to listen to the panel. I'm sure they did a much better job than I can explaining why, what are some of the root causes of why this is happening. But I'll share with you just a couple of conclusions that I came to. And actually, TenantNet was a great resource for me when I was trying to really understand and study this problem. First of all, it seems to me that this problem with gentrification is a trend that was set into motion some 30 years ago, when a group of economists in Chicago were trying to think of a solution to the economic crisis that this country was facing back at that time. And the solution that they came up with was that, we can no longer have strong labor unions in this country. If capital wants to continue to make profits, we could no longer have strong labor unions. We have to get rid of welfare. We have to get rid of affirmative action. We have to get rid of trade barriers. Anything that stands in the way of property owners and large corporations to continue to make profits, we have to get rid of in this country. So that's when we started to see a lot of the manufacturing jobs leaving and going abroad to other countries looking for cheap labor. And that's when we started to see a lot of unemployment in this country, because so many of the manufacturing jobs were leaving. And New York City decided to change, and no longer was it going to be the manufacturing center, it was going to become a financial center. And when it decided to do that and develop the finance industry in the city, they didn't say, let's train the people who were working in these manufacturing jobs before, and the people of color who are living in the city, let's train them for these new jobs in Wall Street. Instead, what they did was they neglected these communities, and they brought in a lot of the young professionals who are going to fill these jobs down in Wall Street. So now you have a whole bunch of young professionals moving into the city and competing for space in the city, competing for housing, competing for luxury services. So that's how we began to see all of this transformation that's happening in the city. And the government was going to facilitate this process. They were not going to protect tenants who are losing, being threatened with losing their jobs, not going to protect workers who are losing their jobs. But they're going to facilitate this process of gentrification. And so in 1997, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room can talk about this better than I can because I was just starting out at that time. But in 1997, as I understand it, there was a huge battle around housing laws. And a lot of the Democratic politicians in the cities basically sold the tenants out, no surprise there. And the new law in 1997 basically did a couple of things that really facilitated gentrification, the impacts of which we are seeing today, we have been seeing for quite some time. So I'll mention some of them and people will recognize them. Number one, they granted landlords what's called 20% vacancy allowances, right? Meaning that when tenants move out of the apartment, automatically they can raise the rent 20%, right? As long as they do a minimal fix-up here and there. So if you're a landlord and you have these tenants who are paying low rents and thinking about how I'm going to make more money, obviously it's an incentive to kick people out. Because as soon as I kick people out and bring in new tenants, the rent goes up 20% automatically, right? This is how the government is actually facilitating this process. Another thing that happened was that they reaffirmed what's called luxury decontrol, meaning that if a rent-stabilized apartment, the rent goes up to $2,000 or above, immediately it's no longer rent-stabilized. Rent stabilization laws no longer apply. So again, if you're a landlord, you're going to think, how am I going to get that rent up to $2,000 so that I no longer have to abide by rent stabilization codes? And so a lot of times, I'm sure it's the case in other communities, what we see in Chinatown is that the rent is raised illegally. Overnight, it goes from $400 to $2,000. And this is illegal, but the problem is nobody knows that this, the new tenant who's moving into this apartment, they don't know that this is illegal. They don't know what the rent was before them. And then the DHCR, which is the state agency that is supposed to be enforcing this, they turn a blind eye. They don't investigate. They don't do a whole lot to make sure that these rents that are being raised illegally are coming back down. The last thing I'll mention is that they removed nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles from the list of what's considered traditional family members. And so that's why we see so many tenants being vulnerable to eviction is because, now if you are living with aunts and cousins, you're no longer entitled to inherit the lease from the leaseholder. So these laws actually make it easy for landlords to gentrify our neighborhoods and in fact create incentives for landlords to displace tenants. So what are we doing in Chinatown? I'll just give you an example of what are some of the things that we're doing in our community. So first of all, we believe that it's really the workers in Chinatown who perform the most basic jobs that make it possible to sustain the city, right? So people who prepare and deliver food, people who make the clothes in the garment shops, people who are construction workers and actually construct these houses. These workers are very essential to the sustenance of the city, but a lot of times they remain invisible, working long hours in substandard wages, with no protections. And Chinatown is really the only place of strength and comfort for the immigrants who are in the city. And we believe that it's important for us to recognize and fight for the rights of the residents and safeguard the community as a safe space for low-income tenants and low-wage workers. And that this fight against gentrification cannot be won without the voice of the tenants who are being impacted by gentrification. So in 2005, we launched the Chinatown Tenants Union, which is the organization of low-income tenants who are living in Chinatown. Every week, our organizers go out, knock on doors, talk to people about the problem in their homes, the problem in the city. We also do tabling every weekend in the community. We use the Chinatown newspapers to talk about this problem. And so now we've built this tenant union to an organization that is a few thousand members strong. And one of the things that we do is we go building by building, building tenant associations, and fighting the buildings that are most vulnerable to eviction and the ones that have been bought up by new landlords who are trying to evict tenants and gentrify. We go in there and try to organize the tenants to fight against the tenants. So one kind of inspiring story is that recently on Delancey Street, there were 2 buildings that were bought up by a new landlord. Same thing, they come and fix up the hallway and slap everybody with eviction orders. And so recently, about 22 households went on a 3-month rent strike against the landlord. They withheld a total of more than $50,000 and forced the landlord to come to a meeting with all of the tenants and negotiate. And one meeting, the landlord, he was so racist and so arrogant that he came in thinking that he could just bully everybody and talk down to them and talk some, like tricky words here and there and trick them into giving in. But the tenants were so prepared and united and really kind of driving home their demand that at the end of the meeting, what actually happened was they chased the landlord out the building and down the street. They chased the landlord down the stairs, out the building, and down the street. And he got into a cab, and people were chasing him down the street, banging on the cab. Poor taxi driver. We're sorry to the cab driver, but they were banging on the car. Huh? The cab driver was not Chinese. And so finally, they won all of their demands. Everybody got $3,000 rent abatements each. All of the eviction cases were dropped, and they are getting now all of their repair demands made. So it's when we think about all the buildings in Chinatown that are going through the similar experience, it's a very, very small victory. But what it does is it actually gives inspiration and hope to a lot of the other tenants, seeing, hey, it is actually possible to win against these dirty landlords. And so that's something that we're doing. And then the last thing that we're doing is we are working in a coalition to make sure that there is language access in all of these cities' agencies. So 311, HPD, making sure that they hire bilingual inspectors, and so that there can be protection for tenants who are facing all of this harassment from landlords who use the cutting of services as a form of harassment. So I'll leave it up. Money for housing, not for profits.
Money for housing,
not for profit.
You have to reclaim it. You got to reclaim it. Thank you so much. Okay, we're now going to move on. We have 2 more speakers. We're going to hear from John Fisher, who's director of Tenants Net, and Quinn mentioned his name in her presentation, and he's going to talk about politics and the tenants movement. Is that correct?
Yes.
We will see. Okay. When Nellie called me, asked me to come up and speak, and she suggested I talk about the politics of the tenant movement. I was trying to figure out what in the heck one can say. This is something I live and breathe every day. I write a few articles every week talking about different politicians, different proposals, basically the politics of what's going on in housing. And it goes out to one of the listservs that we have. And usually I can talk chapter and verse on a particular politician here or there, but trying to put the whole thing in perspective is a challenge. Because how can you talk about the entire politics of the housing movement without taking 20 hours to do so? And I don't know if there's a way of doing that. But I think it's important in approaching the politics behind tenants issues, housing issues, gentrification, displacement, all these different issues. You have to develop a sixth sense Every day I see people at different locations, meetings, conferences, whatever, and they'll talk about different problems they're dealing with in their neighborhood, just like we've heard today. And everything's real, of course, but going beyond the surface of the politics is something that you normally don't see. And unfortunately, in my opinion, is that a lot of tenant groups don't go beyond what's the surface, and they don't understand what's really going on underneath, which is why we keep complaining. Jacob Riis wrote a book 100 years ago about the problems with housing, and 100 years later we're still dealing with the same problems. We don't seem to advance anywhere. I've been working on tenant issues since the mid-1980s, so that's about 20 years, and we're not getting anywhere. And things are getting worse. And so if I could just kind of talk a little bit about the other side of that coin, rather than being optimistic, I'm somewhat pessimistic about a lot of what's going on with the tenants movements these days. And also I tend to combine that with the neighborhood movement, not so much the NIMBY crowd, which is like the housing associations you might see in Queens or something. I mean, they're just as valid, but neighborhood groups, say in Harlem or in my neighborhood in Hell's Kitchen or anywhere else, I see them almost the same thing as the tenant movement. Not only because most people are still tenants, but also there's a recognition that the community is something that comes first. Just as you're talking about here about the displacement of the African American community in Harlem, you can say that for any other neighborhood in whether it's Brooklyn, Manhattan, whatever. So in my view, the community, the small property, or the small owners of stores, all of that is a tenant issue. So I tend to look at somewhat counterintuitive ways of the politics behind things. And that's why, as much as I enjoy Phil talking about empowerment, I enjoy the way you're talking about housing for, money for housing? Not for profit. These are all wonderful sentiments, but the question is, what are you going to do about it? Because in many ways we've been hijacked by the politicians, by the elected officials, by the political groups, and I could go on down the list. You remember it was not that long ago, the phrase wacky pataki? It was only 6 months ago. We don't have one for Spitzer yet, but I'm sure one will come. I remember Tricky Dick, and I remember LBJ. How many kids did you kill today? For those of us that are that old. But essentially, we're presented with the notion that Democrats good, Republicans bad. That's generally how people look at things in New York City, and maybe to some extent there's some truth to that. My view is that the Republicans are going to tell you up front that they're going to screw you. The Democrats are going to tell you up front that they're going to save you, but then they go and screw you. And in many ways, they're all the same. So you can go down the list of politicians, whether it's in this neighborhood or my neighborhood or anywhere in town, and for the most part, they're all going to lie to you. And that's a broad generalization, of course. In fact, there's only two politicians that I know that are, I think, real people who haven't been bought. And I don't know if people are going to agree with me or disagree, but one is Tony Avella out in Queens, and the other is Charles Berry. And those are the only two, in my opinion, that are not just out and out, lying to you day and night. My council member, Christine Quinn, is absolutely horrible. For a lot of reasons, and I don't want to get into that whole thing, but she sold out to developers and landlords the day she took over as speaker. But she's making enemies all over the place, and so she's got to go. But I don't want to single out one particular politician because they're all like this. What we've seen in the last, it's been around for a long time, but what we've seen in the last couple of years are the rise of AstroTurf groups, and that's. You can look it up on Wikipedia, but essentially AstroTurf means fake grassroots. And you see this a lot in the national scene, where, say, the pharmaceutical companies or the drug companies will front a fake coalition, pretending to be a community coalition, but it's really money that's being pumped into groups that are pretending to support things. For example, when the whole thing about the stadium 2 years ago, they had supposed community groups in favor of the stadium. That money was coming from the corporations. The real estate interest. I don't know if they have any groups like that with the whole Columbia thing, but generally when the Bruce Ratner thing out in Brooklyn, the arena, there are groups out there, and they don't have to be newly organized. They can be groups that have been around for a while. For example, Acorn is one group. There's a whole long list of groups that take money from these developers, and they go out and shill for these huge projects and say, we're going to get X amount of affordable housing, which is nice if you can get it, but at the same time you're displacing people that's there. And you have to make a value judgment. How many people are worth displacing to get X number of affordable units? And that's the choice that we're left with. And I suppose there is a number that may be okay at some point, but that's not a decision that you want to let some other group come into your neighborhood and make a decision for you. In my neighborhood, they did the same thing. The group was created by the politicians, not the community, and they essentially sold out on what's known as the Hudson Yards plan, which is much, much larger than the stadium, but 60 square blocks of the west side that's in the process of being dismantled. I look out my window and all I see are construction cranes coming in. So AstroTurf groups, fake grassroots, are organizations that we see all over the place. Then there's the group which Phil and I tend to call Demopublicans, which are essentially the same. You don't know the difference. They talk like one, they act like the other. And these are loose generalizations, so you can apply to a lot of different groups. But essentially, there are well-meaning groups, and some that are not so well-meaning, that have come to conclusions that are basically unthinkable and indefensible. And that includes some of the things that Phil was talking about, like inclusionary zoning, which I just heard this morning, a news report. He was talking about how they're saying that it works in Williamsburg. And I saw a news report out of Australia where they're talking about inclusionary zoning down in Brisbane, and they were saying, it works in Williamsburg, so therefore we've got to do it. And they're putting out this media spin that this stuff is wonderful, but if I don't know how many know what inclusionary zoning is all about. It depends on a lot of arcane, complex zoning things, but essentially the developer builds a small amount of affordable housing, gets a huge amount of bulk bonus that he can put on top of taller towers, which he can sell for $1 million a piece. So you end up getting this small amount of housing. But even that is not guaranteed to last forever. But the real crime in inclusionary zoning is what's known as secondary displacement. And this is what we're dealing with in a lot of neighborhoods, in Hell's Kitchen, in Williamsburg, and I presume in other neighborhoods, is if somebody buys this tennis court out here, or whatever is on the other side of the tennis court, and wants to put up a 30-story tower. Now, I don't know if the zoning allows it, but let's say it does. Okay, so somebody's going to be charging $1 million for apartments, for condos, right here on this corner. And it may happen in a few years, the way things are going. Now, what happens is that the people who own all the other small tenements up and down this block, or blocks up and blocks down, they're going to say, gee, I can get that money too. So they're going to try to evict people and bring in people that can afford a lot higher rent or a lot higher price for the apartments. That's secondary displacement. And you see it all over town. So whenever you have these huge buildings going up, that's generally the impact that you see in an area well beyond it. And that's what you get with inclusionary zoning, because it brings in these larger buildings. Same thing with this other program called the 421A, which you've heard a lot in the newspapers the last 6 months or so. That's not a bulk bonus, but that's a tax abatement where developers get a huge tax abatement and also bonds in order to put up these. It ends up paying half of their cost in these towers. And some people are saying, like Vito Lopez out in Brooklyn, he's saying, well, we've got to do more of it because developers are just getting a windfall. Well, that's true, but instead of getting rid of a bad program, he wants to expand it. He wants to create these exclusion zones, which right now are below, I think it's 96th Street, is that right?
14 to 96.
Which requires landlords to put 20% of affordable units in order to get the tax abatement. That's all nice, but he still gets a windfall, and it still destroys neighborhoods. So he wants to take this exclusion zone and spread it all over. pretty much the rest of the city. And that's going to make things a lot worse, and it's my opinion, and I would think several others, that the 421As should just be done away with.
It's been expanded to include Harlem now.
Have it?
421A.
I know they included parts of Williamsburg, but I didn't know.
But I think it's...
But they're trying to make it much broader, and that's something that's going to hurt neighborhoods all over the city. So we see a lot of the stuff where some of these groups and who you were saying about naming names. I think it's important, and it's not that every group is an evil group, but they can be misguided. And you have, for example, the Pratt Center, which is a planning organization out of Brooklyn, and there's this guy, Brad Lander, who is quoted in almost every article you see talking about inclusionary zoning. And he's been pushing this, he's been acting as an apologist for this, and essentially Pratt, Acorn, the Working Families Party, they've all kind of come together to hijack the tenants movement. Not that the tenants movement was that great to begin with. Back before Pataki came in, it was a different kind of tenants movement, and it probably deserved criticism for a lot of things at that point, but still, you've got groups coming in now saying we're going to go this direction and try to bring in all this inclusionary zoning, which puts all the people into the bases of these towers, and that impacts all the other people living in tenements throughout the entire neighborhood. You also have the weakening of the rent regulations, what you were talking about, that impacts neighborhoods a lot. You have a thing called a community benefits agreement, which is what they're dealing now with the Columbia expansion. The LDC was created ostensibly to negotiate a community benefits agreement. Now, I know Nellie and people from Board 9 and CPC is the name of the group, I believe, Coalition to Preserve Community. Is that right, Nellie?
Yes.
Okay. All of these groups have been working on this Columbia expansion thing. But the politicians came in and created this thing called the LDC, the Local Development Corporation, which on its face is meant to strike a bargain. And what that does, it says there's a price. You're playing your cards before you need to play your cards. When you go into that doesn't mean you shouldn't negotiate, because at some point you should negotiate. But sometimes the strategy should be to stop the project. And I'm not saying that this should be stopped. That's something that the local people should decide what they want to do. But when we wanted to stop the stadium, how do you negotiate a stadium? How do you reduce the size of a stadium? You don't. You're either going to get it or you're not going to get it. And that may be the case with some of like the Ratner thing. There may be some play in that, but you don't want to play your cards ahead of time. So to create an LDC to negotiate a community benefits agreement presumes there's a price that you're willing to accept. It gives developers exactly what they want, which is certainty. That's the most valuable thing to developers and landlords, which is a sense of security that it's going to go through without any glitches, whether they have to go through a zoning process, financing process, whatever. They don't want glitches. They don't want lawsuits. So if they can negotiate something, it's a cost of doing business. But it weakens the community's ability to negotiate on its own terms, because you have politicians telling them you've got to do this or you've got to do that, and the politicians are doing it because they're concerned about their own careers. They want to be reelected. They want to go to the next level up, say from council member to borough president or whatever it is, sometimes mayor or comptroller or public advocate, whatever post they want to run for. Politicians, and I think it's disease that happens when you decide to run for public office, that you have to move up, and you have to take the money from the developers, and you have to make your decisions based on your own career rather than what the community wants you to do. So it's very important for the community to hold on to the decision-making process. It doesn't say you shouldn't work with the politicians. You definitely should. But you've got to make the decision. So as you develop coalitions, whether it's the Columbia issue or other issues that you may deal with, you've got to make the decisions on where you want to go, what your strategy is, what your tactics are, when to negotiate, and on what to negotiate. At what point do you play your cards? These are all very important things, and when you get the politicians telling you what to do, essentially they're shilling for the other side, not for your interest. Also, any community groups that tend to strike out independently are usually marginalized. It's something that they try to do a lot. They'll call you too radical, out of step with the mainstream. They'll call you NIMBY. Bananas is another one. It's an acronym. Build almost nothing anywhere, not at all, or something like that. It's an acronym. I'm just looking at my notes here. See if I covered anything. Oh, there's one other thing I did want to announce. This has nothing really to do with what I'm talking about. Is one of the projects that we're working on is that there's a group in Geneva called the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, and they are going to be releasing a report on Tuesday. And I had hoped to get a copy of it up here, but I'm not allowed to release it. I put this out on the table. I don't know if anybody picked it up, but it's essentially a little teaser saying that they are releasing a report on forced evictions and what they call mega events, which is usually translated as the Olympics. But it could be other mega events as well. And we've seen this primarily in Atlanta and Salt Lake City in the States, but when you get to other countries where the Olympics have taken place, whether it's Athens or Seoul, South Korea, or now Beijing, Seoul, South Korea has 700,000 people displaced when they had the Olympics there. I think it was in 1992. The reports that I'm hearing, but it's not official yet, is so far Beijing has had 1.2 million people displaced in their lead up to the Olympics, and it's still another year till that happens. Now that's on top of all the other problems. Beijing is getting a lot of criticism for a lot of things, a lot of human rights abuses, the Tibet situation, the Sudan situation, Falun Gong. There's a whole long list of what's left over at Tiananmen Square. You can criticize Beijing for a lot of different things, but this is something that hasn't seen the light of day. So this report is coming out Tuesday, and we're hoping to get it around as much as possible, and we'll have a copy of it on TenantNet, or you can go to cohre.org, and I presume they'll have a copy there. If anybody wants a copy, you can email me, and I'll email it. It's a PDF file and all of that. But we want to start putting pressure, not so much on Beijing, on the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee. When they tried to bring the Olympics here a few years back, the Olympics Committee were trying to wash their hands of any obligations regarding the connection between the displacement and the Olympics. And our group on the west side, Patty Hagan from the Prospect Heights Action Coalition, and some other people, we tried to meet with them. They wouldn't meet with us. They basically said it's not our problem. In our view, that it is their problem. If they come into a city, 30,000 people were evicted in Atlanta when they had the Olympics in 1996. And for the United States, that's a lot of people. But when you get into some other countries in different continents, the numbers are much higher. So we've got to start putting pressure on that. So this report will be coming out on Tuesday. Anyways, I could talk a lot longer on politics, but essentially, I think it's important on the tenant issues is that the word was you have to be more militant. And that doesn't necessarily mean getting into the streets or engaging in militant behavior. It means you have to let the politicians know you're not going to take the BS. Because what they do is they pander to you. Whether it's council members throughout the city, whether it's the borough presidents, they come and to some of these rallies and they say they care about tenants, but then they do nothing. They say it's not our fault, it's not our problem, we can't do anything. In the old days they said if only you had the Democrats in the Assembly, you had the Republicans controlling the Senate up in Albany, and you had the Democrats controlling the City Council. The City Council people say we can't do anything because of the Erstat law, So it's up to the Assembly, and right now they've got, I think it's 3 short of controlling the Senate. And if they really wanted to control the Senate, they could, but there's a school of thought that they really don't want to, because that way they can blame the Senate for not doing anything. And if it ever gets to the point where you have Democrats controlling all 3, well, then you've got the Working Families Party, which is covering them, and they're out there saying, oh, we're so progressive. But when you start looking at the working family, they're promoting people like Peter Vallone, and there's a whole long list of horrible people that they've been supporting. So any way you look at it, they try to not take responsibility for not doing things, and we have to stand up to the politicians, whatever party they belong to, and say, we're fed up with it. So that's pretty much.
And that is a very militant thing to do.
That's it.
Well, whatever. And Nellie knows I behaved myself.
Okay, we're going to deviate a little bit before Sam, and we want to welcome Camille Yarborough, who's going to talk about culture and gentrification in Harlem. But Edwin Vega, who's an attorney from the Legal Aid Society, the Community Law Office.
Yes, all right. My name is Edwin Vega from the Legal Aid Society. I've been practicing. Causing a disruption.
No, you're not.
I've been practicing for about 20 years. I represent tenant associations in Harlem and Washington Heights. And I have been, I think, on the front lines of the war against poverty, because housing is a class issue, as was mentioned. By the way, this is a great housing panel. There's not much I can add. This has been very enlightening. But I would like to give you a snapshot of the day-to-day war against gentrification. It goes not block by block, but I think building by building. Harlem is, of course, a prime victim of gentrification. I think it's a very, very complex issue. I'll give you an example. Housing Development Fund Corporation, for low-income people. It comes out of the TIL program, tenant interim lease program. The city wanted to give tenants an opportunity to purchase their apartments for $250. If the tenant association could show that they could manage the building and keep it, above, keep it profitable, or at least maintain it, then they would have this opportunity to purchase their apartments. These would be co-ops. And the co-ops, of course, have board of directors, shareholders vote who's on the board. So now what we're seeing are what I'd like to call runaway boards. I'll give you an example. Not too far away from here, a board has decided to commence eviction proceedings against 10 families. Why? Because they're alleging that it's an eviction plan, and once the lease is up, they can evict. Now these of course are the HDFC. The theory behind this is to keep affordable housing in the community. So what these boards are doing is they're trying to evict low-income tenants and then sell the apartments for $75,000, even $100,000, in contravention of the spirit and indeed the letter of the law. So what we have, these 10 families, they commenced holdover proceedings in housing court. We were forced to start a Supreme Court action to stop the board from continuing to evict these families. We were successful in getting a stay, but it doesn't look good. And our argument was that, look, if you evict 10 families, 10 low-income families, the board can sell these apartments for perhaps $100,000. That's $1 million. And these apartments will go not to low-income people from the community, but to others who are coming in. The point is, you're taking away low-income housing from the community. We were successful in staying the proceeding. It's in the Supreme Court right now. We're not sure that we can win. The city's position was basically this, and this, I think, is a dirty little secret in our community. My clients are on welfare. Some of them are dysfunctional. many, all of them, women with children. They have the right to stay in this community. They have every right to keep their apartments. You have boards who say, no, they're dysfunctional, they don't pay their rent on time, they're a problem, we don't want them. And I think it's wrong. These boards have to be controlled. These apartments are for low-income people. They're not for middle-class people or high-middle-class people. Now, this is the problem we have. Is it really gentrification if people of color who are middle-class or high-middle-class come back to their community and purchase apartments or want to live in Harlem or East Harlem? I'm just presenting the question. I don't have an answer. And in coming in and purchasing these apartments, are they not contributing to gentrification? Now, I was born in the South Bronx, and I maintain that I have every right to go back to the South Bronx and live there, and perhaps, maybe, buy a co-op or rent an apartment that, is $1,500 a month, not that I can afford it. But these are issues that they're very complex issues. My point, or at least the Legal Aid Society's position, is that these apartments are for low-income people, and so what if people are wealthy? So it's a very emotional, very tough issue, because anyone, in my building anyway, in this situation, we're all people of color, we're all from the same neighborhood, we've been here 20, 30 years, and yet you have one part of the building saying, no, you have to go. And I think it's a class issue, and we have to be very aware that we have to maintain affordable housing for people, even if they're women with children, and they're on welfare. It does not make them pariahs. They should not be evicted. And if middle-class people don't want to live next to people on welfare, well, tough. And we have to continue to make sure that those who cannot protect themselves remain in this community. Now, something else I wanted to mention. DHCR. DHCR is the worst. They are so anti-tenant. It's just incredible. It was mentioned before. I think one of the how do you fight against gentrification? One of the things is to keep rents down. So people, you got to fight for every nickel increase. I mean, you have to fight to keep your rents as low as possible. MCI increases, major capital improvements. The state, the HCR, permits the owner to do some lousy work and then submit an application seeking permission to increase the rents. And there was a building in Washington Heights where the rents were, it was like $15 to $20 per room. And people simply cannot afford MCI increases. Yes, we want to live in habitable apartments. Yes, we want new gas lines, perhaps pointing. But I think landlords are milking the system. They are doing shoddy work and then submitting these applications for permission to increase the rents, and people simply cannot afford it. I'll give you an example. In Washington Heights, the rents went up by $200 a month. Now, it is true that these rents are phased in. You can't, you have to pay a maximum of 6% over a long period of time. But they're permanent increases, and I think it's landlords are using this MCI to increase the rents and make it less affordable for the tenants to live there, especially senior citizens. I represented the DeBar. How many of you know the DeBar?
Yeah.
The DeBar is I think a great example of a big time owner, Joe Wiener, right? He comes in, he has all this money, buys up all this property in the Bronx and Manhattan, pays a lot of money. Well, how do you think he's going to pay his debts? He has to increase the rents, and he will do anything to do it. He'll start holdover proceedings, alleging that the senior citizen perhaps has pets. He'll start nuisance holdovers, saying that the family makes too much noise, all sorts of things. He'll drag people into court for any reason, hoping that they'll be so intimidated that they'll leave. So that's why it's important that tenants form associations where they can educate themselves with respect to defenses in court, such as warranty of habitability, rent overcharge, harassment. You can go to trial if you have a lot of problems in the apartments, and you can try and get an abatement, which is a reduction. It's a credit towards your rent. But the other issue, and very quickly, demolition. I have a case downtown in the Village where the landlord purchased the building, right? He just purchased it and then submits an application to DHCR to demolish the building. Now, and DHCR will let him. What he has to do is simply come up with a finance plan and submit an architect's, plan to build a new building. Now, the protections afforded to tenants who are already there are, well, he has to pay them more or find comparable housing. But to me, what is astounding is that there's nothing wrong with this building. It has very few violations. Yet, DHCR will allow the owner to demolish it if he meets certain obligations. But to me, it's another example of how the system is set up so that affordable apartments are taken out of the market and made into luxury apartments. So that's it.
Preferential rents.
Preferential rents. Yes, a landlord can, if your rent's $1,000, the landlord can say, okay, you'll get tenant. I'll let you in for $800, and he'll write it on the lease, preferential rent. Now, unfortunately, there's a law, last year or 2 years ago, that said that a landlord could decide after the expiration of the lease to get rid of the preferential rent. So now you got to pay the legal registered rent. It's out, and there's some controversy here. It's our view that the preferential rent is part of the lease, and that you have to renew a lease on the same terms and conditions as the prior lease. So in our view, the landlord cannot just unilaterally get rid of the preferential rent. DHCR, that's supported by case law. There's some other judges who disagree. It's an issue that's very controversial. But in our view, we tell our clients that they should fight this. If the landlord suddenly says, no, you got to pay me $200 more because that's the legal registered rent, my argument would be, no, you gave me a lease, you have to renew it on the same terms and conditions, and any increases have to be based on the preferential rent. But it's very controversial. I don't know if anyone on the panel has anything to add.
We said at Collingwood. Remember Collingwood?
Yes.
Back before 97, which essentially said if they charged us less, it stayed at that level until the next tenant came in.
Right.
And that's kind of what you're saying.
Yes.
Just go back to that.
And the last thing, hall room negotiations in landlord-tenant court. Tenants sign stipulations that they cannot live up to. And how would you educate, what would you tell tenants about that and to be careful of? And also landlords writing in legal fees as part of the money that's owed without it being approved.
All right, when you go to court, as you know, a lot of tenants go to court, they don't have representation, they're not entitled to representation, although I disagree that housing is such an important human right, as was mentioned before. Housing court for a tenant is a nightmare. It's as simple as that. Usually you're taken to court because you don't pay, they're alleging you don't pay rent, you're served with a petition, you go to court, and usually what happens is many tenants are approached by the landlord's attorney, and the attorney will say, well, you owe this amount of money, how much time will it take for you to pay it? And give me a judgment. That's it. So a tenant who doesn't know, okay, you're right, I owe the money, and I'll sign the stipulation, and all of a sudden there's a stipulation, an agreement that says that the tenant must pay X amount of monies by a certain date. A judgment is given. That's a final order